Welcome, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends, colleagues, good afternoon. As you know, this event is a celebration of our good friend Kishore Mahbubani's memoirs, titled Living the Asian Century. The event is co-hosted by the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the International Council of the Yong Lu Lin School of Medicine at the National University of Singapore. My name is Danny Kuan. I'm Dean and Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to the beautiful Fullerton Hotel for this launch of Living the Asian Century and a panel discussion on the contents of the book itself. The star of the show this evening is, of course, Kishore, to whom in a minute I will turn over the running of the proceedings. But at the same time, I want to warn you that in addition to Kishore's wonderful presence among us, we will also get to enjoy the conversation with a truly star-studded panel. Chan Heng Chee, formerly Singapore's ambassador to the United States for 16 years, and thus the longest serving in that position. Heng Chee is among the greatest of experts in our part of the world for understanding the United States, and in turn, for helping the United States understand us. We'll also have Tommy Koh, formerly Singapore's ambassador to the United States and the United Nations both, chief negotiator on the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, president of the Third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. In our time, Tommy is one of the world's greatest of international diplomats, and through his continuing presence these days on social media, a voice of good sense and conscience for all of us. And we will have Professor Wang Gu, the most accomplished and distinguished of academic scholars in all of Asia. He is our era's surest voice of intellectual authority in this part of the world. I'm going to hand over to Kishore now, but I cannot resist the temptation to make one quick comment here further. Everyone should read Living the Asian Century. I learned many things from having done so. One significant piece of learning, a little bit tongue-in-cheek on my part, is that when you follow the arc of Kishore's journey, every time he leaves a place of work, he comes away realizing that he had made more enemies there than he thought he had while he was still there. Study the book. In my copy of the book, I have yellow highlighted where all of these things occurred. Cambodia, the United Nations, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the list goes on and on. My entire book is now highlighted yellow. But of course, I also want to speak from my own very selfish, self-centered perspective that arguably the most prominent of all the places he's worked comes from his being the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So I'm especially delighted this evening to welcome him at this Lee Kuan Yew School event back again to the Lee Kuan Yew School, where he was dean for 14 years, a good long while compared to other places he had been. So at this point, I rushed forward to that part of the book where he talked about his leaving the Lee Kuan Yew School. What should I say about his enemies here at the school? I can reassure Kishore that the school is unlike everywhere else he has worked. This is the one place, apparently, where the number of enemies Kishore thinks he had actually exactly equals the true number of enemies he made. Please join me in welcoming Kishore Mahbubani to the stage.
Thank you, Danny, for those very warm, welcoming remarks. I had lots about enemies, very little about friendships. Thank you, Danny. Let me, first of all, thank you all for coming. Really, really grateful. It's such a wonderful to look around the room and see so many good friends in this room, and I deeply, deeply appreciate your support. So I want to explain to you very quickly first the structure of this event that we're going to have now. Heng Chi, Tommy, Gangbu, and I will come up here and speak for about 5 to 10 minutes. And after we have done so, we will have a discussion among ourselves, and then we will have time for questions from the floor too. So I'm going to begin my remarks very quickly with several thank yous. It's very important, these thank yous. First, to Danny Kwa for his very warm, welcoming remarks. And now, second, to everyone from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, especially the brilliant events team led by Nanik, and the team from NIC and my team from RE for helping me to organize. And you can see that this is a spectacular book launch. I want to thank, thirdly, my good friends, Heng Chi, Tommy, and Gangbu for participating in the panel discussion. I can tell you, by the way, you will never again get a panel with 336 years of experience. First time in Singapore's history. And I also want to thank Mr. Robert Ng for hosting this event at the Fullerton Hotel. And finally, I want to thank all of you here for coming and joining me today. Now, let me begin by explaining why I wrote these memoirs. When I turned 75 in October last year, I thought that the moment had come to share my life story. By so doing, I hope to thank some people who had made a huge difference to my life. Firstly, my parents, as I explained in the book. I'm really grateful my parents chose that I was born in Singapore, because I could have easily have been born in Guyana or Suriname or Nigeria or Ghana or Hong Kong or Tokyo. And all these places I have first cousins, by the way. So I could have been born in any of those locations. By an accident of history, I was born here. And I can tell you, if I wasn't born here, I wouldn't be standing here today. Secondly, I want to thank especially the three key founding leaders of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Mr. S. Rajaratnam. If you read the book, you'll see how much I learned from them. They taught me a lot, and I hope my book will help to explain why they're really special. And finally, I also want to thank all those good friends of mine who have stood with me through many of the challenges I've had. I also hope that my description of the ups and downs that I have had may prove useful to others. As you will read in this book, I face adversity at many different points in my life. So to give you a flavor of the book, I'm going to try and briefly tell you my life story. And I'm going to apologize to Tommy Ko. I cannot make 3 points about my life story. I'm going to make 5 points, Tommy. And the 5 points all begin with a D word. And the 5 Ds are deprivation, dissension, diplomacy, deanship, and discovery. So let me start with the first D, deprivation. And here I had probably a very typical third world childhood in a poor Singapore home. When I was 6 months old, my doctor actually told my mother I would not survive a severe bout of diarrhea. The doctor told my mother, your son is gone. I survived. When I was 6 years old, I was put on a special feeding program when I enrolled in primary school because I was technically undernourished. Now, as you can see, I'm overnourished. In the first decade of my life, we had no flush toilet in our home. My father lost his parents early, sadly. Hence, he accumulated bad habits, gambling, drinking, smoking. My father went to jail in 1962. And quite amazingly, what's shocking is that I obviously went through lots of traumas, but amazingly, I can't recall them. And as I describe in the book, one of my good friends, Jeffrey Sung, who's here, amazingly could remember a very dramatic episode, and he shared it with me. And this is the words I'm going to read from Jeffrey Sung's description. What happened is that he was sitting in his house, which is 100 yards from my house, sitting in the veranda. He saw a crowd rushing down the street. He said, "What's happening? What's happening?" They said, "Oh, it's a fight." And so Jeffrey went with them, ran with the crowd, reached the crowd, and then now I'm going to read his words. He says, "I pushed my way through the crowd, asking the onlookers in Malay and Hokkien dialect, 'What's happening?' 'It's a fight,' someone replied. As I nudged my way, body against body, to the front row, a police car arrived. A policeman was already walking past the tables on the shop floor towards the large counter where the shirtless Hailam Chinese owner was standing. People's attention was directed to a particular spot next to the large counter. They were looking at an Indian man standing by a table with a broken Tiger beer bottle and a broken beer mug. His white shirt, wet with beer, was torn and spattered with blood. He had an unshaven square face and neatly pomaded shining black hair part in the middle. It suddenly struck me that he was Kishore's father. The shirtless coffee shop owner was standing nearby, but hesitated to approach. Kishore's father, the object of attention, looked drunk and fiercely defiant. Meanwhile, the policeman who came from the patrol car made his presence felt and started asking questions and waving his notebook. I couldn't hear what was said. Then I suddenly noticed that Kishore had shown up next to the policeman and was calling out loudly, "Dad, Dad." He went up to his father and took his arm lightly with an anguished expression, said, "Please come home, Dad," said Kishore. The Indian man with his torn shirt let himself be led by his son out of the kopitiam. The crowd parted to let the father and son pass through. I watched them cross the street together. Kishore's house was almost right across from the kopitiam. Kishore walked his father up the front steps leading to the door of the house. The door opened and they disappeared inside. Unquote. As you can tell, this is obviously a very traumatic event. I was probably about 10, but I have zero recollection of this event. Fortunately, Jeffrey remembered it. And so maybe, if you don't mind, special round of applause for my friend of 70 years, Jeffrey. And here's a tip for all of you who want to write memoirs. Find your old friends. They will tell you stories that you have forgotten. But amazingly, I can recall other incidents. My neighbors coming to the house and said, "You must come." I said, "Why?" "Your dad is in the longkang. He's drunk. Go pick him up." And then another time when Chinese gangsters came to our house, my father rolled under the bed and tell them I'm not home. And I remember the look of sheer terror in his eyes at the prospect of being caught by these gangsters. So these I can remember. But the incident that Jeffrey describes, I can't remember. So it was, to say the least, an interesting childhood. The second D is dissension. I had never even thought of going to university since I had to help support my family. But as many of you know, fortunately, I got a president's scholarship paying me $250 a month. That was more than what I was earning as a textile salesman on High Street for $150 a month. So my mother said, "Okay, $250, more than $150, you go to university." And that's literally how I ended up in university. But unfortunately, instead of studying hard, I became a minor student radical. I believe Heng Chi will speak about one episode. And since the government was seen to be very tough and authoritarian at that time, my role as a student dissenter should have gotten me into trouble. Instead, I believe sincerely that this is actually how the founding leaders of Singapore first heard of me when I wrote this article suggesting that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was becoming a dictator. But at the same time, I think I can also tell you that even Dr. Goh noticed me. When I graduated in 1971, he invited me to the Ministry of Defense and says, come and join my group of whiz kids and you'll do very well. I'll promote you very fast. So I said to him rather foolishly, I said, by the way, his office, if those of you remember, was a huge office with a tiger skin right in the middle of his office looking at you. So he said, come and join the Ministry of Defense. And I said to him, I'm sorry, Dr. Goh, I cannot join the Ministry of Defense. I'm a pacifist. He gave me a look of total contempt and threw me out of the office. But one more significant event in university I want to mention, because I want to mention this because one of the lessons I learned in life is when you're down and out, what you do remember is acts of kindness. And there's one act of kindness I received in university in 1969, which I've never forgotten, because as you all know, I was very, very poor, but I wanted to travel, I wanted to see the world, so I became friends with an American exchange student in the university, and I said, I really want to see Nepal, can't go. Somehow or other, before the exchange student left, he just came up to me and he says, Kishore, here's $2,000, 6,000 Singapore dollars at that time, cash. Go see Nepal. Amazing, isn't it? What's more amazing is that this American exchange student was now living in Colorado, took an economy flight from Denver to Seattle, and then an economy flight center seat from Seattle to Singapore to attend this book launch. Dean. One act of kindness can create 55 years of friendship that cannot be broken by all the oceans in the world. Kindness makes a huge difference. The third D is diplomacy. I intended to stay in MFA, frankly, for only 2 to 3 years to serve out my bond and then to go and leave to pursue academia. Instead of staying 2 to 3 years, I stayed 33 years in MFA. The book explains why. But one key reason was that I discovered that small states like Singapore are underdogs in the global system. I found it very meaningful to help defend Singapore and Southeast Asia in the face of all our disadvantages in the international system. And finally, to be completely honest, I fell in love with geopolitics. And since at that time I had the best geopolitical minds in the world teaching me, I would have conversations with Lee Kuan Yew, with Goh Keng Swee, with Rajaratnam, and I learned so much from them. And I hope that my book will bring out some remarkable things about this, and I hope our conversation here today also will explain why they are special. But at the same time, even though I spent 33 years in diplomacy, I won't say much now because I believe our discussion will focus on it. The fourth D, Danny has already mentioned, was the deanship. And I can tell you that I've had many low moments in my life. One of the lowest moments was in the year 2002. Singapore was exiting the UN Security Council. My 2 years in the Security Council were amazing. I learned more in those 2 years than I did in the past 31 years. Amazing. But then what was going to happen to me? I felt completely lost. I didn't know what the hell I was going to do. I got very depressed. In fact, I developed acute back pain. I had to stop jogging for a year. I couldn't play golf for a year because I was acutely depressed. But then out of the blue, amazingly, the then Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Tony Tan, came to New York, bought me lunch one-on-one. He says, Kishore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew is turning 80 in 2003. He has finally agreed to name a school after him. And so we're looking for a dean. Will you accept? Immediately I said yes. So that for me was a plunge into the unknown to join academia. But I loved academia. And at the same time, to be honest, it was also a great honor to helm the first institution to be named after Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Some of my fellow civil servants thought I was mad to take on this big risk. I saw it as an opportunity, and I'm really glad that after 13 years, we achieved a lot for the school. It became the third best endowed school of public policy in the world, thanks to the name of Lee Kuan Yew, and clearly taken as a peer by many of the leading schools in the world. And I'm glad the school is continuing to do well under Danny's leadership. Thank you, Danny. The fifth D is discovery. And I can tell you, when I stepped down as dean in December 2017, I thought I was heading for retirement. I had no job, no monthly salary. But amazingly, the past 7 years have been among the most fulfilling years of my life since I retired. In 7 years, I produced 5 books, some of which have developed a very wide readership. Amazingly, my last book before this one, The Asian 21st Century, an open access free book, has been downloaded over 3.6 million times in 160 countries, when the target for downloads was 20,000. That was a goal. I believe this happens because the world is psychologically preparing itself for the return of Asia. Now, when I was born in 1948, Singapore was still a British colony. It was unimaginable that Asia could ever rival the West in influence. But now I'm grateful to be living through the rise of Asia and to have had the opportunity to explain Asia's rise to the world. And I actually believe that the next 10 years of my life are probably going to be the most interesting years of a very interesting life that I've already had. So finally, in conclusion, as you can see, despite the unpromising beginnings, I've done reasonably well in my life. I have a lot of people to thank for my success. But those of you who know me well know that there's only one 4-letter word that explains my success. It's spelled A-N-N-E. And thank you, Anne. Now we have Tommy, and then Gangbu and Heng Chi. Thank you very much.
Professor Danny Kuan and your talented wife Lim Ai-lin, Kishore Mahbubani and your muse Anne Mahbubani, Prof. Wan Gang-woo, Prof. Chan Heng Chi, members of the Kishore Mahbubani fan club. After hearing Kishore speak, I think all of you will agree with me that his life and career is nothing short of a miracle. So will you join me giving a big round of applause? Kishore asked me to speak briefly about his career as a diplomat. Kishore had served in many different places as a Singapore diplomat, beginning in Cambodia. And he was fortunate in that he survived the bombing of Phnom Penh by the Khmer Rouge. He then moved on to Kuala Lumpur, where he was the Deputy Chief of Mission under High Commissioner Wee Kim Wee. And from Kuala Lumpur, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he was the Deputy Chief of Mission under Panch Kumaraswamy. He made many friends of Singapore, both in Malaysia and in the United States. In Washington, he practiced something that I advocate, market diplomacy. And he was so successful that the Washington Post actually wrote an article about his chef prima and about the wonderful meals that she cooked for Kishore's parties. He then succeeded me in 1984 as Singapore's permanent representative to the UN. His success at the UN can be reflected in the following transaction. He was invited by the UN to facilitate a negotiation between the Western donor countries and the African donee countries. To have been requested to play this role means that he had earned the trust and confidence of both the Western and African delegations. This is a role that Singaporeans are often asked to perform, to be a facilitator or neutral chairman. Kishore rose through the ranks and attained the highest office in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that of the Permanent Secretary. In a move which he described as a demotion, but I described as a promotion, he was sent back to the UN to serve again as our permanent representative during the 2 years in which we were members of the Security Council. And I want to explain how special this was. We have been members of the UN for 59 years, but we have only served once as a member of the Security Council. And Kishore was the leader of our delegation to the UN Security Council. So for him to say this was the demotion is not correct. And I must say that our delegation performed very well in the Security Council. And of course, high praise is due to the leader of the delegation, Kishore. Kishore, as you know, is a rebel. So when he was at the Security Council, he tried to break the hegemony of the 5 permanent members. But it was not possible. They were too powerful. He also resented the fact that behind the scene, the United States was controlling the work of the Council. He also fought against that. And he had some success. He made the work of the Council more transparent, and he made the Security Council more accountable to the General Assembly. To sum up, I would say Kishore's unique combination of intelligence, vast knowledge, charm, and eloquence made him a world-class diplomat. And during his diplomatic career, he had brought honor and distinction to Singapore. Kishore has given me permission to disagree with him, but he said to do it gently. So I want to say to Kishore that I have 2 disagreements with you in your book. First, I disagree with Kishore's characterization of Lee Kuan Yew as a die-hard geopolitical realist. This is on page 78. The truth is, Lee Kuan Yew's inspiration was not realism, but pragmatism. A die-hard realist would not have as much respect for international law or multilateralism as Mr. Lee did. Mr. Lee was a conviction politician, meaning that he governed by conviction rather than by reading the opinion polls. He was a skillful statesman, but I would submit to Kishore that his lodestar was not realism but pragmatism. My second disagreement with Kishore is on page 185 of his memoir, in which he said, "The world of international affairs is a jungle." So with great respect, Kishore, the world is imperfect, but it is not lawless. It is true, of course, that the rule of law is often broken by military powerful countries, such as Russia and Ukraine, and Israel and Gaza. But we still live in a world governed by laws, treaties, courts, and tribunals. The international rule of law is often violated But it would be wrong to say that we live in a world with no laws. If it were a jungle, as Kishore says, there would be no use for diplomats, no use for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, no use for courts and tribunals. We would all be working for the Ministry of Defense. And we will all be warriors. In conclusion, let me emphasize that notwithstanding these two minor disagreements, I believe that Kishore is a world-class diplomat and a national treasure of Singapore. He has brought honor and distinction to Singapore. And as Kishore knows, I've always admired him in spite of his many imperfections. I've also tried to protect him from his detractors and critics, including on one occasion, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I need hardly say that I'm in a very privileged position to talk about Kishore to all his friends and his admirers. I'm also one of them, so a sort of associate member of the fan club. It is a privilege to be invited to say what I think about Kishore's memoirs. Unlike Tommy and Heng Chi, I come from a totally non-diplomatic, if not undiplomatic sphere, and not at all equipped to talk about serious matters concerning issues of peace and war. So I shall therefore provide some relief from the fractured world order we now face and focus on Kishore's powerful encounters with university campuses. I met Kishore in the 1990s at a memorable meeting when I heard him lead a conference with the challenging question, can Asians think? He handled the rather provocative question like an accomplished professor, challenging the students to show that they can think. While everyone knew he was the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I was impressed. This gave me my first taste of Kishore's brand of undiplomacy. A few months later, he asked me to speak at the launch of his collection of essays with his best essay, Can Asians Think?, as its title. I had learned by that time that of his exceptional background as a student of philosophy at the University of Singapore. To follow philosophy by choosing a career in foreign affairs was, I thought, rather unusual. No wonder he was different. Reading his memoirs has taught me something more. When I got to his chapter, and I draw your attention to it, Studying Philosophy in the Cold, that was really an eye-opener for me. I knew nothing about his being ready to leave the Foreign Service in 1974 when his former philosophy professor offered him a teaching fellowship at Dalhousie University, where there he chose to write about John Rawls and Karl Marx for his master's degree. In his words, and I think I can do no better than quote him here, I quote, "I expected to find more insights from Rawls, who was considered the greatest living American philosopher of his time. Indeed, I learned a great deal from his classic volume, A Theory of Justice, and I continue to cite it in my writings. Yet it became clear to me during my year of studies at Dalhousie that Marx was a much greater philosopher, delivering far greater insights into the modern human condition than any other social and political philosopher. He was also more idealistic. This comes through even from a quick read of his essays in the 1966 volume edited by Baltimore titled Karl Marx, Selected Writings in Sociology and Social Philosophy." Unquote. I was astonished to read it, to be honest. The early Marx in that collection was one of those theory books that, in historical studies, that I thought I was being very brave to praise when I was teaching in Kuala Lumpur. But that was not all. Even more surprising was to go on to read that Kishore's sympathy for Marx brought him closer to Dr. Gokeng Sui. Let me quote again in case you don't believe me. I quote, "My master's thesis led Gokeng Sui, who was then both Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister, to invite me from my diplomatic post in KL to Singapore to deliver 6 lectures on Marxism in the Ministry of Defense to the senior officers and the Singapore Armed Forces. I was asked to deliver this series of 6 lectures 3 times because I spoke to different cohorts of officers who had enrolled in MINDEF. However, what I remember most vividly is the first series, because Dr. Goh attended all the lectures, sitting in the front row of the auditorium to listen." Unquote. So these are Kishore's words. Now this is, to me, the highest form of non-diplomacy that I can think of. The story of the defense minister of a pragmatic anti-communist city-state listening approvingly to 6 lectures on Marxism by someone who put Karl Marx above John Rawls is almost beyond belief. I can go on, but let me not be carried away. A few years after his book, Can Asians Think, was published, Kishore and I became colleagues at the NUS. He was appointed Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I chaired the governing board. There I saw him not merely thinking, but also in high-flying action. His mind was on the big story. The school should become the public policy school for the rest, the way that the Kennedy School in Harvard was the one for the West. And he drew on his years in MFA for a distinctive global view. His stint at the United Nations, especially that in the Security Council, taught him what small states could do if they shared their dreams and manifold skills. The school brought together international scholars to examine the Singapore model for both its successes and its failures in policy making and implementation. Its students were challenged to bring their multiple experiences from their respective countries and learn from the courses that were offered there. That kind of learning could provide a unique perspective on the road to modernity that they all needed to know. The years I served as governing board chairman alerted me to what more Kishore could do beyond being dean. The 4 books that he authored during that time were just a beginning. I believe that they prepared him well for the bold views that he began to share with a world that had become deeply divisive. What I saw was a professor, or the professorial half of Kishore, taking over and finding his teaching role for global adults even more fun than his years in foreign service. If he was destined to be undiplomatic, he has demonstrated that there is no better place to start than this little red dot state of his. May I offer my congratulations to Kishore for showing us the way. Thank you, Kishore.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tommy and Gangwoo dealt with Kishore's public persona. Tommy spoke about Kishore as a diplomat, and Gangwoo of Kishore as a thought leader, a university thought leader and builder who energetically launched the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy into the international academic orbit. The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy is considered one of the leading schools of public policy today. Now, I would like to use my time to talk of both the public persona and the private persona of Kishore Mahbubani. There is still one dimension of Kishore as a public persona that has not been covered. Kishore as a public intellectual. Now, what is a public intellectual, you may ask? Edward Said has a rather erudite and political definition of an intellectual, which includes engaging in the advancement of human freedom and knowledge and sharing these ideas with the public. So he was moving to define the public intellectual. I will simply define a public intellectual as a specialist in a particular field who is well known for a willingness to comment on current affairs or on issues and concerns of society. And increasingly, you would have noticed that scientists, hard scientists, are becoming public intellectuals. Now, from his memoirs, I learned that Kishore developed this interest to comment on what is happening in society in his university days as the editor of the Singapore undergrad. In June 1969, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew had come to the Bukit Timah campus to give a talk. This was just after the May 13 devastating racial riots that had taken place in Malaysia. The student moderator refused, at the Prime Minister's request, to cut short an audience member, a philosophy tutor, who went on at length to disagree with the government's abortion policy. I think Prime Minister Lee was worried about the impact of the riots on Singapore, and he had no patience on that day to listen to all the questions on academic freedom and now this on the abortion policy. Kishore's infamous editorial on this incident suggested Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was heading down a path of dictatorship. It was a harbinger of the op-eds he would later publish, hyperbolic and sharp, revealing a Kishore prone to be radioactive. This aspect followed him subsequently as a public intellectual. Now, what is well remembered is Kishore's op-ed in the Straits Times in 2017 on Qatar, Lessons from a Small State. I think you all remember that, which argued that small states should behave like small states. This has been discussed. Oh, you didn't discuss it, Tommy. A number of voices came in loud and strong to disagree with Kishore. Bilahari Kausikan and the Ambassador at Large, Ong Keng Yong, and also the Minister of Home Affairs, Mr. K. Shanmugam. It was Kishore's point of view, but this was robustly put down as dangerous thinking. Singapore's strategy of survival, after all, was predicated on demonstrating we are not a pushover state and we are not easily cowed, and that we stand for principles. Now, as a public intellectual, Kishore advocates ideas, especially ones challenging received thinking. It is important in any society that seeks advancement, innovation, and resilience to allow the articulation of different ideas. Others can criticize and come down hard on the idea if there is disagreement, and the author of the idea should expect a fierce rebuttal and stand up to it. This is what happens elsewhere, in the United States and in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure in Europe too. I believe that that particular exchange on small state strategy was good for Singaporeans, deepening their understanding of the issues at hand. Now, you may remember too that in 2014, Kishore launched his Year of Big Ideas column in Straits Times, which led to the publication of he wanted it to come before the publication of The Big Ideas of Lee Kuan Yew. For the 90th birthday, a group of us wrote essays, and this was The Big Ideas of Lee Kuan Yew. A year later, it was to be published. Kishore, being Kishore, decided a run-up was necessary, so he came out with The Big Ideas of Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore believed that Singapore in the future would face more stresses and strains than ever before, and it was necessary to think about how the country could maintain the same level of development. He wrote 10 op-eds, 10 ideas for Singapore, and then one more, an extra column. This ranged from idea number 1, a car-less society, car-less Singapore, to idea number 5, speak the national language. Idea number 8, nurturing the art of compromise, to idea number 10, love Singapore. All sensible ideas for policies to make Singapore more successful in the next 50 years. Kishore argued that it was important to encourage more ground-up nurturing of virtues at this stage of the country's development, then have virtues taught or enforced top-down. And invariably, he received bouquets and brickbats. Now, all this illustrates his tireless mind, which seeks to think through ideas which can be useful or helpful to Singapore's progress and survival. We may not agree with all of his ideas or any of his ideas, but he enriches our society by generating ideas for discussion. Now let me speak to the private persona of Kishore Mahbubani. That Kishore has a huge ego is a fact. As friends of Singapore, we all know. That Kishore is his own best publicist is also well known. You will recall the many Kishore interviews we watched during the COVID lockdowns. They were Zoom interviews, and Kishore was looking straight at you on the screen. But behind you, you would notice there were 2 books, Kishore's latest books, one to the left and one to the right. And I thought, Kishore, such obvious advertising. Now, soon afterwards, whenever I watched academics or journalists giving interviews on YouTube, many of them would have a copy of their latest book on the shelves behind them. So Kishore has started a trend. But they only had 1 book. But the Kishore many of you may not know is the helpful and generous mentor that he is. I succeeded Kishore at the UN in 1989. I know Kishore made it a point to remind MFA that they would have the first woman ambassador in their history. She was coming to New York at a time when it was unsafe and homeless were on the streets and high crime rates. This was before Mayor Rudy Giuliani cleaned up the city. He urged MFA to allow me greater use of the official car for my safety. MFA has a very strict policy of the use of the official car. It was a detail, but Kishore knew it was very important. And he also told me, Kishore, the driver can be, he said, Heng Chi, the driver can be your bodyguard as well. So that was quite well thought through. Thank you, Kishore. But what stands out in my mind is that Kishore, who took me around in the non-aligned conference in Cyprus in 1987 and in the UN in 1988, and to introduce me to the UN community of diplomats and to the Secretariat. I was getting a taste of my future job. Minister Dhanabalan, Foreign Minister, then said, Hengchi, go and have a look. Go to the non-aligned conference, go to the UN and get a taste of the job. It was a demonstration, I think, on this visit with him of Kishore's subtle style of diplomacy. He could not say that I would be his successor, as I had not been appointed yet. So Kishore introduced me each time, saying, this is a very important lady. She is my boss. Okay? Now, Kishore had acquired some status and respect at the UN as a PR, permanent representative. So it was an intriguing and ambiguous statement. But it made the other side take notice. It was very effective. Kishore is a great mentor. He encouraged me to deliver speeches and to intervene, and he would give me feedback on my performance. As we walked through the corridors, he would alert me to the important people to cultivate and why, who would be helpful, which countries were good allies and which were not so reliable. He gave me the lowdown and the tips. Quite thorough. This was very generous and allowed me to build up my foundation and my network. Let me end my remarks by sharing one other private aspect of Kishore. In his memoirs, he tells the reader of the troubled home and poverty he struggled with in his youth. Today, fully aware of his family's circumstances, he continues his responsibilities of supporting his extended family of sisters, nieces, and nephews for their education and medical needs, an admirable undertaking. So Kishore, may your storied life continue with as many adventures in the future as in the past, and I am certain you will make more noise.
I'm not sure we can have a sequel to what has been said. Thank you all very much for your generous comments. But we are going to have a brief discussion here. And I was going to begin by talking about a very interesting phase in our lives in the 1990s. And this was when, after Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had stepped down as Prime Minister and he was a senior minister, he had more time. So he would actually, from time to time, invite Tomiko, Hengchi, and myself for lunches at the Istana. And I remember those lunches as being remarkable occasions, you know. And the thing about Mr. Lee Kuan Yew is that when he's on stage and he's in public, he's very fierce and, you know, formidable, and everyone's very scared of him. But when he's in private, in a private conversation, he's one of the world's best listeners. And he has an incredibly curious mind that very few people are actually aware of in many ways. So Tommy, you can tell us, and Hengchi, tell us a little bit about what you remember about those lunches with Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, I missed them, you know.
You missed them?
I missed them because here was this great man who invited the three of us to have lunch with him regularly. And he would brainstorm ideas with us. He would invite our own perspectives. And he was never rude to us. He was very respectful of our different views. He was eager to learn from us. This is a new dimension of Lee Kuan Yew that I had not known before. I must say that after Lee Kuan Yew, no Singapore leader ever invited the three of us.
Hey, our standing went down lah. So Hengchi, what do you remember?
We didn't go for the food. It was very Spartan. I think I was the rookie amongst the three, you know, because they had been diplomats far longer than me. But I remember Kishore and Tommy saying, Heng Chi, why don't you say it first? He won't bite you. But honestly, at that time, as I recall, Kishore, Tommy, it was just the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union had dissolved. It was a new time for Singapore. That was when he wanted to test out his ideas. And he didn't want people just to agree with him. So he invited the three of us for lunch, and that was what it was about. He would try out ideas, and it's how we react. You know, he would state his views about certain powers, and we would say, no, that's not how this country behaves. This is a history, and so on. And I think what was remarkable was the fact that Mr. Lee actually listened, as Tommy said. But the other thing is also, he pounces on your ideas and pounces in the way that he disagrees with you and he argues back. So the first time it happens, I had such a shock. Then I realized that's his style of argument. You must be able to take it. He will argue back very fiercely because he's a lawyer, you know, and he wants to win his argument. So if you melt, that's the end of it. So I think after a few lunches, I understood the tempo, the rhythm, you know, of how the conversation.
I think I would say that what struck me the most about the lunches with him, and of course other conversations with him, is how curious he was.
Yes.
He was constantly asking questions, constantly trying to figure out what was happening. But in that regard, I would say that was also true of both Dr. Goh Keng Swee and Rajaratnam too, that all three of them had very curious minds. And the things I would enjoy the most was spending time with them were all the questions that was raised. Kangbu, you must have dealt with Dr. Goh Keng Swee, right? When you were running the EAI, he was the one who recruited you.
Well, he was a different kind of a person. He was not that politician through and through the way Lee Kuan Yew was. He was very much an intellectual. His interests were not necessarily whether something was practical or not. He was also concerned with the intellectual correctness, accuracy, and so on. So it's difficult to talk to him because you can make mistakes and he immediately corrects you and so on. But in general, I think to me, the extraordinary thing was that he and his very intellectual approach towards politics, you could allow him to survive with Lee Kuan Yew. This is a kind of partnership that I found fascinating, that these two men who were very different in many ways could work so well to make Singapore the success it has become. And that ability for these two men to understand each other, even though they're so different, is actually part of that history of that period, which we need to understand.
Yeah, it's very unusual to have two strong men who can work so well together. That's very...
Well, as you know yourself, we're sitting down listening to you on the Marxism.
Yes. Eng Ching?
No, because you talked about Dr. Goh Keng Swee Kishore, and because you mentioned that he asked to see you, and you told him you're a pacifist.
He threw you out.
Threw you out. I think this is the unusual quality about Dr. Goh Keng Swee. I came back from Cornell and I had just published a book. Alex Josie trashed it. I wrote on the politics of survival, Singapore 1965 to 67. I had a phone call and I was asked to see Dr. Goh Keng Swee. He was then Minister of Defense. He was just curious to see who I was, because I'm the first local to write extendedly on Singapore politics. He asked me what was my background, who are my parents, my education. It was just getting to know. He said, I don't agree with this part of your book. This one is okay. He said I got it wrong reading relationship between Singapore and Malaysia. I said it's race, but it's also the personalities. And he said it was more race. Then he called me up another time when I wrote another piece, Nation Building in Singapore. Told me he liked the piece, So I saw him twice on this. I don't know if leaders do that now. because for the young Singaporean trying to lead, we are building the country then, first days of nationhood. And I guess he saw us as the future influencers of the country. The two meetings I cherish that, and I think he also tried to speak up a bit for me when I annoyed Mr. Lee.
Tommy, you add anything about Dr. Goh Keng Swee?
I think Dr. Goh's enormous contribution to Singapore have not been adequately acknowledged. Many young Singaporeans don't know who Dr. Goh was and what his contributions were. And he founded many institutions. I mean, apart from being a brilliant finance minister, he was also defense minister. He started the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, founded the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, started the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in the Bird Park, He was a really Renaissance man. But I want to share with you a story that you probably don't know. Singapore were very lucky to have him as our first finance minister. Although we were poor in 1965, but he decided from day one that we would have a budget surplus every year. And a few years after that, when I was at the UN, Dr. Goh wrote to me and said, Tommy, we have some saving. Could you approach two American banks, Lehman Brothers and Lazard, and ask each of them to manage a sum of money on our behalf? So I went to see the two banks, and they, of course, were happy to look after us. Then a year later, Dr. Goh phoned me and said, can you find out from the two banks how much money they made for us? So when I checked with the bank, bankers always blame the market, right? So they say, very sorry, the market is bad, we lost money, Both of them lost money. So he decided to withdraw the money, and this led to the beginning of GIC. He said, we must learn to manage our own saving.
Good. By the way, we have a few minutes. I don't know, does anyone have any questions from the floor you want to ask?
I think there's a hand here.
There's a hand there. Oh, Simon, please. Simon Chesterman. Can someone provide a microphone, please? No, I think they need it for the recording, for the camera. Yeah. Thank you, Simon.
Sure. Simon Chesterman, National University of Singapore. Although I got to know you, Kishore, back in 2000, just before you took on the role at the Security Council. And I was shocked as a person who had just been working in a think tank for a couple of months that the first time I met you, you said, Singapore's going on the council. What do you think we should focus on? And I was sort of surprised, but then got to know that epitomized the curiosity that you were just describing to Mr. Lee and Dr. Goh, that you embody that yourself. And I think that's been a great virtue through your career. A life is often said to make more sense in retrospect, looking back, than it does moving forward. But I wondered if, in the process of writing this book, if there were things that you wish you had known at different points of your life that you think might have helped you, in particular before the three sort of phases that Tommy, Gung Wu and Heng Chi have talked about, that you wish you'd known before you became a diplomat, before you became a dean, or before you took on this role as public intellectual, things that you might have benefited from, or at least would have thought, gee, it'd be nice if I'd known that in advance.
Wow. That's a difficult question. The strange thing about my life is that there was never, I didn't have any sense of direction. I wasn't determined when I was young to going to spend 33 years in diplomacy. I thought it was a job I had to do for a few years, and then if it was okay, then I would switch to something else. In fact, by the way, for the record, I did apply to become a journalist, and SPH Holdings, Dick Wilson was then working as an editor there, interviewed me, recruited me, offered me a job. I accepted it, and I went to submit my resignation, and I was told to throw away my letter of resignation. So I wasn't allowed to leave the civil service. It's accidents along the life that went on. But the thing about my diplomatic career is that it was participation in different incidents and events that sort of evolved how I saw things as I grew along. And I can tell you my 1 year in Cambodia, when living in a city that was shelled every day, made me acutely aware of how serious war is, And then you begin to study what happens, why do wars happen, what are the forces that lead to the creation of war. So there's nothing, I can't give you any kind of a game plan that was there. It was events and incidents. It was like I was in the middle of a river and the river was pushing me and I was bouncing along. I don't know whether that answers your question, Simon. Any other? Okay, one more question. And then I think we are beyond schedule because there's a very good wine and canapes waiting for you.
Hi, Kishore, Chris Chia. I want to know, was there a specific moment in your career that you look back that forged your views on China, that you decided that you were not going to go with the mainstream, that you were going to challenge everyone who spoke kind of in a certain way about China, because you've been known that way. And I just want to know, was there a specific moment in your life that forged that?
I would say no specific moment, but certainly the fact that when Deng Xiaoping came along and carried out this massive reversal within China, and to me it was astonishing because Mao Zedong had complete control of China, complete, absolute control. And he had set in stone many policies that seemed to be eternal and fixed. And despite all that, Mr. Deng Xiaoping could come along and carry out this remarkable change that unleashed the animal spirits of the Chinese people and created this dramatic surge of China. So it was that big event that got me fascinated to find out, how did this happen? And by the way, there's a contrast, as you can see. Not all societies succeed in turning things around and succeeding. But China somehow or other managed to do it. But having said that, I do believe that China is going to go through a very difficult patch over the next 10 to 20 years. The US-China geopolitical contest will definitely accelerate. Things will get more difficult regardless of whether Trump wins or Harris wins, irrelevant. The contest will get more. And so for all of us in Singapore, I think it's very important that we understand this contest as well as we can, because it is going to have lots of ramifications for all of us. So I tell you what, I'm sorry, I think my apologies to you all. It's already time, because I know many of you got other commitments. So there are two things I need to do. First of all, I need to thank my fellow panelists. And if you don't mind, the four of us, I've got to stand up for a group photo.